Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
The Red Apple Media Podcast Network presents This is Protecting America. Now, here's Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby.
And welcome to another edition of Protecting America. I'm Rita Cosby. There are so many hotspots around the globe, and many blame a lack of leadership from President Biden. So what is President-elect Trump inheriting in terms of world conflicts, and how differently will he handle these many crises? Well, joining us now to discuss this and much more is Victoria Coates. She is former Deputy National Security Advisor under President Trump, also Vice President at the Heritage Foundation, and she is the author of an awesome and very well-timed new book, an important topic. It is called The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. Victoria, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, Rita.
Let's start where your book topic is, with Israel. Can President Trump coming back into office really help Israel a lot, especially with the war on terror?
Oh, I think absolutely. And President Trump took a unconventional approach to Israel, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to lay out for the American people how successful he was by simply and unapologetically standing with Israel. There was no question about it. He moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He recognized the Golan Heights. I mean, thank heavens he did that, given what's happened recently, as sovereign Israeli territory. And you know what happened? A lot of the Arab world just fell in line and said, okay, that's where you stand. We want to stand with America, so I guess we stand with Israel too. And we said, great, let's get to these Abraham Accords. And so I think that kind of clarity will also inform his second term. The challenges will be different. We have an Iran that's much further along with its nuclear program than it was when he handed that portfolio over to Joe Biden in January of 2021. We have China that's controlling Russia, Iran, and North Korea much more than they were when he left office. So there'll be new challenges, but I think his clarity, particularly in the Middle East, will be a breath of fresh air.
And obviously that was felt throughout Israel, it seemed. I mean, Netanyahu was one of the first people to congratulate President Trump when he won the second term, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, they've been in close touch over the course of the last 6-7 months. And they spoke as recently as yesterday and today, because that relationship is so much better, regardless of who the president or the prime minister is. They should be talking regularly. And under President Biden, and who decided to demonize Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, duly elected, I would add, government of Israel, that just became really problematic and difficult. But you have to talk all the time to make sure everybody's on the same page, everybody's sharing the same information. No surprises was always our hallmark in the first Trump term. So hopefully that'll be much better very quickly.
You talked about clarity. It seems the Biden administration quite often was waffling or undermining even Israel.
Oh, they were so confused about it. And this is, again, a major theme of the battle for the Jewish state, is a lot of Americans ask, I think rightly, why are we allies with Israel? Is there an alternative? Like, sure, there are several alternatives. One of them's the Palestinians and one of them's the Iranians, and they're both disastrous. And we've gone down those rabbit holes so many times, and we need to look at that and then also look at what we get as America out of the relationship with Israel. And it's everything from security and intelligence cooperation to so much more, biotech, agriculture, all of these areas where Israel, like the United States, excels. We can collaborate. We get so much stronger when we're together. So I think, these are the reasons that we need to be mindful of this relationship, not just as something we do because we're Christians or Jews and we love Israel for that reason. We may do that, but this is a practical case, Rita, that we need to make for this alliance because it makes the American people more safe.
It's also been extraordinary what Israel has done, Victoria Coates. I mean, look at the accomplishments in terms of taking out the terror leaders. And I still think back about that pager attack. I mean, that was one of the most incredible feats, I think, in modern warfare ever.
Well, not surprisingly, that happened just a couple of weeks after Prime Minister Netanyahu was here in the United States for his address to Congress. He met with Vice President Harris. He met with then candidate, former President Trump. And whatever he heard in those two meetings, and I suspect it was a combination of the two, completely changed Israel's tactics. And he went back, ordered the execution of the pager attack, which obviously had been a long time in the making, but they decided they would trigger it that September. Then they went after the leadership of Hezbollah, which has been bedeviling both Israel and the United States out of Lebanon since the mid-1980s, early 1980s, actually. So this is a long-term problem that they started to solve, taking out up to the head of it, Hassan Nasrallah, who had been considered untouchable for these many years. So this, I think, was a really sort of catalyzing event. And what Israel has done, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, and now in Syria, taking out all of these weapons depots of the old Assad regime to make sure they don't fall into terrorist hands. I mean, this is doing the Lord's work for us. And this is why the American taxpayer has invested $150 billion over the last 70 years in Israel. It's paying dividends.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
You understand the Middle East well, and obviously Reagan's mantra is peace through strength. Explain why that is important, especially of all parts of the world, but in the Middle East.
Well, Rita, anyone who tells you they understand the Middle East well is probably lying.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. There's nobody who understands it, but yeah. You know it better than most. How's that?
I'm not going to make that claim, but I would say about President Reagan, and this was also one of the really fascinating things about writing The Battle for the Jewish State, is most people don't think about Reagan as a Middle East president. Obviously he was a Cold Warrior. His focus was on defeating the Soviets, and to his enormous credit, he did it. But at the same time, he did a number of fundamental things that set up the modern U.S.-Israel alliance in terms of both the qualitative military edge for the so-called QME for Israel. He defined that for what it was going to be, that they would always be technologically more advanced than any country that could attack them. He set up the security arrangement, the memoranda of understanding that we've had ever since 1981 until now between us and Israel, the intelligence sharing, and perhaps most importantly, the first free trade agreement the United States ever signed was under President Reagan with Israel. And so he created all of this, and then I think the crown jewel in all of that was the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the first missile defense program, which is what then launched all of the wonderful Israeli programs in that area. So I love going back to Reagan's peace through strength. That's the essence of missile defense. Nobody ever went to war with missile defense. This is what you do to prevent a war. And so I think we could do a whole lot worse than getting back to our Reaganite roots as we go forward into the second Trump term.
As you talk about Reagan, I think so much, are we sort of in a Carter-Reagan moment? Many people are sort of equating that just the way they've handled foreign policy. But also, President Trump has said to Hamas repeatedly, return the hostages by the time I come back in or else. And people are wondering, will it be sort of almost like a Reagan moment where maybe, the hostages are returned at that timing?
If there's any reason left in Hamas, that will be the case. And I was in Israel when President Trump made his desperately needed Truth Social post about what had happened what his views rather on the hostages, that they had to get released now. It's not bring them home. It's you people release them now or there will be hell to pay. And he's been asked recently, what does that mean? He said it's going to be really unpleasant. And so if Hamas has any self-preservation left, he should know that the president will be talking to his good friends who are the leaders of Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar, who are their interlocutors, and he will be saying to them, this is not a negotiation. These are the terms. This is how it's going to go. And if they don't do it, then, all bets are off. And I'm sorry, we wanted better for them, but this was their choice. And so if Hamas has any smarts, they come out tomorrow. Get them out now. And it's not beholden on the United States and Israel to bring them home. It's beholden on Hamas to let go those poor people who have been there now for 15 months.
Yeah, it is amazing. And yet our current president, President Biden, barely ever talks about the hostages. I mean, it's been in passing references. Isn't it astounding to you, as an American and following foreign policy and national security issues, that we don't have a president who's pounding his fist every day? President Trump has said more about the hostages in a much more forceful tone than our current commander-in-chief has.
No, and this again is something I trace in the battle for the Jewish state. President Biden talks about them through Christmas of 2023. When he was in Nantucket and there were still deals being made and hostages were coming out and he wanted credit for it. But very quickly in the beginning of 2024, he stops talking about them, stops mentioning them. It's just kind of the unpleasantness. And they start talking much more about humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza and a ceasefire and don't go into Rafah and Israel has to be restrained and that hostages fall out of the headlines and nobody talks about them. And it was the most remarkable thing as you start tracking the administration sort of communications over this period. It's like they just didn't want to mention it. And then suddenly President Trump, once he was reelected, comes along and says, this isn't funny. Here's the deal. And I think we also heard that from Prime Minister Netanyahu around the time Sinwar was eliminated. Here are the terms. You let them go. You lay down your arms and maybe you can live. Like that's not a ceasefire. That's not a negotiation. Those are terms that you people can agree to or not. And then we'll just keep going. But I think in this case, just President Trump's instincts are 100% correct. And unfortunately, what we then had was another year underground for these poor hostages because President Biden wouldn't speak up for them.
Do you think it was all politics or lack of fortitude? What was it?
I think entirely politics. I think what their big problem is that the youth vote in the United States has become really anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And much more than the Arab American vote, that youth vote is what Biden and Harris were counting upon for reelection. And, those people don't want to hear about the hostages. They want to hear about aid to the Palestinians and a Palestinian state and all of these things. And so for them, politically going into an election cycle, and I think Vice President Harris, much more than President Biden, tends towards the far left view of these things, the much more pro-Palestinian view, and she was driving the policy. obviously, for most of this year. For them, that this was a political no-brainer. Don't talk about the hostages, talk about the Palestinians.
Wow. There are obviously a whole bunch of hot spots around the globe, and a lot of them are intertwined, as you so eloquently described. Syria is another. Obviously, the recent fall of Assad fleeing to Russia. There are said to be, I think it's like 9 tribes there that are all kind of competing for control right now. How much of a mess is Syria, and what can we expect coming out of there?
Syria is literally a witch's brew, and it's the most artificial of the sort of Middle Eastern states that were created around World War I to try to bring order to the then post-Ottoman Empire. And so essentially you've got 3 major parts of Syria that just are never going to get along. And what we're seeing is the fracturing of that. I am glad Assad is gone. He and his father were horrible dictators who had tortured, murdered, dropped chemical weapons on generations of the Syrian people. No one is going to be sorry that that family has been moved out of power. But the problem is, Rita, the HTS people who have been moved in are Al-Qaeda and ISIS alums backed by Turkey, who are bringing potentially radical Islam to the government of Syria. And the big conflict there is going to be with the Syrian Democratic Forces in the east part of the country, which, following President Obama's policy, have been the United States partners in the counterterrorism activities that we've done in that country. So, I agree strongly with President Trump. We don't have a dog in this fight. There are no good guys. I wish the best to the people of Syria. They deserve hugely better. I don't know that it is in our power or capacity to impose that. And so, I think good Assad is gone. Great deal of caution about HTS and all of their friends, and just a lot of concern that you have folks in the United States government who are trying to drag us into yet another endless Middle Eastern conflict in Syria.
Right. It seems like a never ending. You're right. What about Russia, Ukraine? Where do you see all of that going? And do you see, it seems like in the last, few weeks, and it's certainly a credit to President Trump, Zelensky has talked about maybe there's some deal. Russia seems weakened because they couldn't help even Assad, and they've been pulling in the North Koreans. Is this a moment where a deal could be struck?
Well, this is clearly where President Trump is focusing, and he said this in one of his statements on Syria, which is now beholden on Russia, which has been revealed to be weakened. And he went after them very specifically. They couldn't help their henchman Assad, and so maybe they would like to improve their international standing by coming to a reasonable deal on Ukraine. And so I think he is rightly focusing on that as something that if we can get it resolved in the early days of his new administration, that's going to free up all sorts of things, and capabilities, money, all sorts of things that can be very beneficial to other parts of the world if we need to deal with the Pacific or more with the Middle East. And so I think the message to all of our European partners should be, it is time to get this wrapped up. I would be, again, extremely cautious about NATO membership for Ukraine. There's a reason they weren't in NATO in 2022 when the Russian tanks rolled in, which had nothing to do with the war. It had to do with the fact that they don't fulfill the criterion for membership. So we can't use NATO membership as a messaging criteria. We can do other things to support and assist Ukraine. Russia should not be awarded for what they've done over the last 3 years. And I think that is very clear from the former president's, or rather president-elect's statements. But I think we can also get the situation to a resolution.
Does it seem that President Trump is sort of the de facto president already? Many people coming there, as you mentioned, all these world leaders calling him. I think about also when he was over there in England, rather in Paris, and for Notre Dame. and Zelensky flies in to meet with him. And it's, President-elect Trump and Zelensky and Macron. And then all these other world leaders are sort of shaking his hands, Prince William meeting him. Is he essentially I've never almost seen a transition where the president who's coming in really has taken all the headlines, all the control of the story, everybody reaching out to them. It's like, okay, Biden's clearly gone. Let's not even worry about him. It seems as the message on the world stage.
No, it is remarkable and unique. And as you said, those pictures from Paris on December 6th, and as an art historian, Rita, I was particularly pleased to see the beautiful restoration of Notre Dame. It was awful what happened in that fire. I remember sitting in my NSC office watching that happen. And just, it was a strike at the heart of Western civilization. And this was a rejuvenation of that tradition, and wonderful to have the president-elect there. And as you said, everybody's treating him like he's the president. And, he is speaking with clarity. He's the one who's there, who's bringing people together, who's holding discussions. And so it already is happening in a remarkable way. Now, the only problem we have is that we've got another 30, whatever it is. Not that I'm
right. I was going to say a lot of damage can happen between now and January 20th, Victoria.
So we got to keep an eye on that because, the president's trying to get his team in place. He's trying to pick all of his guys. He's trying to get his policy sorted. But the authorities still rest with President Biden. So I think everybody has to be mindful. The Congress has to be very mindful of what's happening. And, this drone story from my, home area of Philadelphia, New Jersey is case in point. Nobody trusts them. And so it's going to be a difficult couple of weeks, but hopefully we'll get through it and happier times are ahead.
Yeah, let's hope so. Definitely clarity, definitely strength, and definitely respect for America, which all of that is so important, and it can't come soon enough. Everybody be sure to subscribe and share to this podcast. Victoria, it was so great to have you here. And I also encourage everybody to get your awesome new book. Again, it's called The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. Victoria, really great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Rita. Merry Christmas.
And everybody, I'll be back soon with another great edition of Protecting America. And of course, you can catch me every weeknight, 10 p.m. to midnight on the legendary WABC Radio. This is Rita Cosby, and thanks for all you do to protect America.